So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is our kickoff podcast related to the Learn the Signs Act Early project that we are doing here in Minnesota. And today I am absolutely delighted and honored to have with us Dr. Anne Gearity. She is the assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She is also a consultant at the Washburn School and is the author of the Developmental Repair Manual, which is in wide use throughout early childhood circles. And in addition to these two things, Dr. Gearity has her private practice as a psychotherapist, and she mainly focuses on attachment, early development, and the impact of toxic trauma on children, and works with both kids and their families. So welcome, Anne. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Let me just clarify, it's the Washburn Center.
The Washburn Center, pardon me.
That's right.
Okay, pardon me, and thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay. So as I had shared in the introduction, we're going to be talking today about what does resiliency look like as we go forward and kind of do these 2 steps forward, 1 step back dance in the wake of COVID and everything that has happened to us over the last 18 plus months. And so today we just are hoping to be able to benefit from your wisdom and expertise. In your words, hearing about what resiliency means to you and how you see this through the lens of looking at kiddos and families. So do you want to just start us out by sharing a little of that?
You know, COVID has, it's certainly been a challenge, but it's given us a new word with it, which is immunity. And in some ways, resilience is like immunity. You know, how do we get some kind of protection against the things that happen to us so that we can keep growing? And you know, we're all talking about immunity now, and that's the job, is to protect our children's health and well-being. When we think of immunity as a psychological experience, you know, the biologists are working on building immune structures to protect our bodies. We're thinking about how to build structures that protect our ability to keep growing and keep going. Deb, for me, more and more, I've been thinking of mastery and this idea of how do we help children feel masterful? And how do we help parents support that mastery? Start with masks, because I find masks have been fascinating. I'm still
say more about that.
Well, I'm quite awkward at putting on my mask. I have it on. I wish I could take it off, and yet many children have managed much better than we expected and have adapted more easily to this idea of masks. I watched a group of children go into a school, and there they were. No one was pulling, tugging. They were just going on. And I think, especially when they were able to copy each other, they really had a sense that we can do this. You know, that just became part. I think where masks got hard was when adults were conflicted, then children were confused.
Right.
So when it's not, when it doesn't become part of, you know, how we function, that's when children get confused. And I had several older children say to me, one kid literally said, "Don't sweat the small stuff." And, you know, I was so impressed. I think they got it, that COVID was hard and they had to do something to keep themselves safe. So why did this happen? Well, I think learning is about, it's not about what children are told, it's what they experience, right? So children experience the threat and we watch them do that process. They assess the danger, kind of said this adversity is real, so we got to take it in. And then they found ways to keep themselves safe. And in some ways, wearing masks became akin to learning not to be reckless on the playground. They assessed the danger. They said, I can figure out the adversity, and here's what I can do about it. I think it's really very compelling to us to see that children manage adversity when they have the tools to do it. And math became one of their tools.
Sure. So this is interesting because we know children aren't born knowing those tools. And so we know that children develop within the environment of their caregivers. That's part of that, that caregiving environment. And so primarily their parents and families. So when you look at how children gain these tools and you think about how they learn to assess and respond appropriately, how does parenting enter into that equation?
Well, I think if we go all the way back, we know that we always start with connection, right? So connection is the first building block. And the more solidly children feel connected, the more they can start to build their own tools. So lucky the children who have that connection and feel like their parents are there to take care of them. Because the second step in development is exploration. And think of the circle of security model, children go from security to exploration. So attachment is not about staying home. It's about taking that security from home and going out and exploring. And so a lot of times parents during COVID felt like they had to, I think the new term is snowplow, that they had to put all the danger away. They had to clear out the danger and they had to keep their children safe from all danger. That's connection. But it's not getting to the next task, which is really how we build resilience. You go out and explore and you remember how I took care of you so you can start taking care of yourself. So I think the better kind of parenting is helping children recognize danger, allowing danger to be relative, assess the danger, and make sure your children have the resources, and then help them master the danger, which is the third step in development. How do you learn about the challenges and master it? So the lovely children who are going off to daycare and knew how to put their masks on and go into the school and play all day with masks had done exactly that process. Their parents had helped them transfer the sense of protection from mom and dad to me. And then they could say, I did it. I know how to do it. And that's what mastery is. Mastery is having both the confidence and the competence to manage a hard situation. And feel like I did it is really me. So we talk about self-esteem has got to come from inside, right? We don't give children self-esteem. We recognize when they did it and we say, you did it. And the kid says, I did it. And that's what mastery is.
Yes. And, I think about that as being, when you talk about self-esteem, that symbiotic relationship, that self-esteem comes from that struggle and that mastery. And in the process, it teaches a child and adults, all of us, I think, respond that way. That we feel good in the face of when we do have to stretch ourselves a little bit and we're able to be successful. And so I think about resiliency even for adults. This has been a heck of a year when I think of people trying to meet the basic needs of their families. And as you said, to keep their children safe, both physically and emotionally safe, and continue to meet those everyday demands. And for them to look back at the end of 18 months and to say, my gosh, we're still standing. We may be really tired, we may have bruises, but we did it. is real cause to pat oneself on the back.
So you're talking about another really important dimension of mastery, which is that it's hard to assess how we're doing while we're in the middle of it.
Absolutely.
It's hard to know how much stress we can tolerate.
Yeah.
So if we think of the stress system and we think of stress as not to be avoided, but in some ways to be embraced, because you can't learn without stress. You can't live without stress. Now, this last 18 months has been very stressful, but it's also been in some ways easier. You know, lots of families have reported that they've reduced their activity level. Families of young children, the kids are just so happy not to be racing around and to be more connected. I think we have to look at it in its complexity and see what worked and what didn't work. And that's a big part of keeping stress tolerable. You know, how do I engage my brain? How do I use my resources? And for children, how do I tap into the adults in my life so that I'm able to manage the stress? We don't want to eliminate stress. We want to manage stress.
So since you've raised this incredibly important topic of stress, a lot of us have been hearing for years now about toxic stress.
Okay.
And consequently, and it's even made it down into parenting circles. And so a lot of people are really afraid of exposing children to any kind of stress or things that challenge them because they are aware of the fact that stress can be harmful. Can you talk a little bit more about how we make a distinction between what you've just referred to with respect to positive stress or stress that is growth promoting versus stress that is toxic and quashes development and resiliency?
So I like the word tolerable because stress is hard, but we tolerate it and then we learn from it. Now, toxic stress, I define as too much for too long with too little help. Right? So it's not that the stress is unbearable, but it goes on for too long. So the child is exhausted by the task, or it's too intense. So the child's resources run out. You know, I can manage for this long because I have resources and then I'm depleted. The third one, though, is the most important, with too little help. So I think instead of thinking of I have to protect my child from stress, we want to help parents think about when there is stress, I have to join my child. I have to be available to my child. Because we know from the earliest papers on childhood trauma that children's resources are incredibly intertwined with adult availability. And especially for young children. So it's not so much what's happening outside, but what's happening inside for the child. Is the parent able to mediate the stress, to explain the stress, to name the stress, to encourage mastery of the stress?
But not to take away the stress.
Well, you can't. I mean,
exactly.
That's magical thinking. Somehow make it go away. And we were all humbled by COVID. We couldn't make it go away. So what we had to do was learn how to manage not COVID, but the threat of COVID.
Right.
And the mastery part was what was so important. How did we help children have narratives? COVID, I love saying blame it on COVID. You know, COVID is just really crabby. And I get crabby by, yelling too much, and you get crabby by throwing your toys. Oh, that COVID is really making it hard. So I'm not going to yell and let me help you pick up your toys because we'll feel so much better. Now, we didn't do anything about COVID, but we sure did make ourselves feel connected and competent,
Right.
and that's the kind of help we need to give parents so they can give their children. How do we help them help their kids get masterful?
Right.
And masterful, again, isn't solving the outside threat. It's solving the sense of being overwhelmed inside.
Right. And so, I want to circle back to something you just said about a child throwing toys, which could be a trigger for many, many adults, right? And so adults are supposed to be really good at using words. It's a phrase I recall using regularly with my children when they were little. Use your words.
Use your words.
Use your words. Say more about how you're feeling. So we know that children, however, tend to use behavior as a form of the way they communicate. They maybe don't yet have the mastery of words.
Right.
And so how do you think about, or can you share with us some of what might be things that parents should be looking for if we're thinking about behavior as a way of communicating stress that's becoming really difficult for a child to manage?
Right. So I think we really, as providers to families and children, need to know our stuff. So the first thing we need to know is that stress is felt in the body. It really is a body experience, and it hurts. So children feel it in their bodies. And when we have a body experience, our bodies get reactive, which is what behavior is.
Right.
The second thing we have to remember is that use your words is aspirational. We know that by 11 children can start using words with a little more sophistication. We know that the frontal lobe doesn't mature until 25, and yet we're saying to 3-year-olds, use your words.
Use your words.
They don't have many words.
No.
And they don't have the processes that can quickly transfer body feelings into words. The third thing we know about young children is that they have a confusion about inside outside. So often when they feel stressed, because they're so dependent on us, they assume that the stress is coming from the outside. They perceive the outside as the cause. So they fight back. And sometimes behavior is a gesture of fighting back against a perceived threat, right? And so we really have to remember that their behaviors are talking for them. And what we do is two things. We soothe them so their bodies don't feel so agitated, and then we lend them words. And the best sentence is, use your words, here's the words.
Yes.
And because when we give them the words in the moment, it matches.
Right.
We give them the words when they're calm, it doesn't stick. But in the moment, especially when we do it kindly, we start to help them move from behavior to words.
Yes.
And that's one of the ways we reduce toxic stress. We move it to words. Because once we can talk about it, we can talk together. So there's a connection. We can explain it, name it, and tame it.
Name it to tame it, exactly.
And we can help them start to see that their words are effective, master. So when a child says, I hate COVID, and I say, I do too, wasn't it hard? That's an incredibly masterful conversation.
Yes, yes.
But we can't start with words. We have to end with words.
Yep. I think that idea to me always, and I've shared this with you before, is that idea of joining alongside a child and honoring their response and honoring their feelings, because they know they are seen then.
They see themselves as agents in their own experience. So I
Yes.
see you, and then you see you. And because
Mhm.
you feel seen, you can act.
Right. And that gives them
Right.
power to
Right.
be resilient and to
Right.
persist.
Right. Let me add
Um,
one other thing about toxic, because I
sure.
think there's something else that we call toxic accumulation. And
Mm.
what that is that past stressors make us more vulnerable to current stressors.
Okay.
So, if your child has had X and Y and Z, and then
Mhm.
COVID comes along, they're going to be more vulnerable to the new stressor.
Ah.
But if we can again use words, and I call this trauma narratives or stress narratives, if we can help children know that when X and Y and Z happened, remember what we did,
Mhm.
remember how it was hard, and you learned to go to sleep, and I helped you, and remember we did it, so we can do it now. Then toxic
Right.
accumulation flips into resilience. Now I'm building on past experiences, and I'm reminding the child, remember we did it.
I think this is such a critical point, Anne, and it actually is a great segue into the final things that I'm hoping you can talk about a little bit as we think about looking ahead and hopefully hopefully coming out of this, although right now we're in the middle of the Delta surge, and really it has created an ambiguity where none of us are sure,
Uh-huh.
which that in and of itself. So how do we
It's
in
just part.
this, yeah, as we look ahead, hopefully coming out of it, but still having to live with and make peace with this ambiguity of where life is moving. Um, so it sounds like one of the major things that we can do is to always tie the concerns or the worries or that stress back to past areas of mastery and being able to do it in order to face new stresses.
And
Are there any other things that you
yeah,
would add to that?
absolutely. So reminding the child that he did it or she did it is a
Mm-hmm.
way of accessing the feeling. So the story is secondary. Lots of us elaborate on our stories.
Mm-hmm.
We remember a hard time and the child didn't manage that well. But when we tell the story, we use a little parental license and we say, remember, you did this so well. And what
Mm-hmm.
you're accessing is the feeling of mastery and the feeling of
Got
mastery
it.
with me. Um,
Got it.
the words are not, we say make it in words, but we always want to remind parents less is better.
Mm-hmm.
Children do not talk in paragraphs. We got to remember Charlie Brown's adults. Wow, 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 wow.
Yeah.
So stories are not long-winded. They are short and to the point. And the point is, remember we did it, call up the memory, and bring it to now, right? Because we're creating a state of mind in the child. Now, to do this, my most important advice is parents take care of yourselves. Because
Mm.
if you're stressed, your child will act it out. A
Yes.
lot of times throwing that toy is not because the kid is scared of COVID. The kid is
No.
scared that you're yelling. And you're
Yes.
yelling because of COVID. So really encouraging parents to take care of themselves and to use language that has mastery in it. So I'm so disappointed. It's a lovely mastery center. This is, some of you know the book Pete the Cat. I love Pete the Cat.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yep.
cry, goodness, no, he just keeps going because he gets disappointed. And disappointed is a mastery word, right? It's a little bit
Yes.
better. It's a little more organized than mad. Giving children words that I can use and you can use. So that kind of active modeling is really important. Another advice, so I'll tell you my next favorite book. I should have had them here so I could do a show and tell. I love Grumpy Monkey. Such a good book. Jim is so grumpy. I love Grumpy Monkey because everyone wants to fix Jim's grumpiness, and it's not fixable. So I think we also have to remind parents that grumpy, angry, annoyed, frustrated are not toxic, right? They're not toxic. They're just emotions.
Right.
If we give each other space to have emotions, children will master them. They won't stay grumpy forever. I think under COVID conditions, we were kind of like our forefathers who were living in shacks in the winter, and we all had to stay. It hasn't worked, right?
Yes.
Kids need to be able to have feelings.
Yes.
And ask questions. Tell me why you're grumpy. What's it like to be grumpy? It's kind of hard on me when you're grumpy. So how would you be grumpy in the living room? And when you feel better, come into the kitchen. That's all lovely language.
It is.
Right? But asking children questions is so important. Now, you can hear the undercurrent of all this, Deb, is kindness.
Yes.
That's what I worry about the most, as we're also depleted. I think our disposition for kindness is getting a little frayed around the edges.
Yep.
Don't
I
you?
agree. Yes.
And it's a hot summer. It's a hard time.
It's hard to be patient and kind when we're tired.
It is. It's hard.
Yeah.
And yet children are so responsive. We
need
know that positive affect facilitates learning a lot.
Right.
And we know that negative affect actually inhibits learning. So I want parents to be thinking about, what do you want your child to learn and how can you help him learn it? And when we think of resilience, we want children to learn to be sturdy, right?
Yes.
To be able
I like
to
that word.
recover quickly. We want children to be flexible, right? To kind of spring back from a bump. And we want children to keep growing.
Yes.
So when I think of resilience, I think of sturdy, I think of flexible, and I think of going forward.
Yes. And as I think about everything you've just shared, and I think about the variety of professionals that are working to help families and children right now, I think about how they create the relationships with families, and hoping that a lot of those same approaches that we encourage parents to take with their children will also be present in those professionals.
Absolutely.
The kindness,
so we can
the
go
questioning.
down that list. Absolutely. These are the professional qualities that the providers want to carry into their encounter. Because if we don't do it with the parents, they have a much harder time doing it with their kids.
Exactly. And it takes me right back to where we began this whole conversation. You talked about the idea that this all happens within the context of relationship.
Right.
Of supporting that relationship.
So let me say something about that, because that's the other thing I think we've overused. We've said relationship. And I think providers are getting exhausted. I've gone through periods where I just don't know if I can maintain this relationship stance. So I've been thinking a lot about it. And I think we have to say instead, use your relationship intentionally. So what you're doing with these podcasts is upping the competence and confidence of providers. We want to use that same idea of mastery.
Yes.
And when I'm intentional, when I'm thinking about what is mastery, how can I help parents stay in the mastery lane? How can I explain behavior so parents stay kind? How can I help parents use words that are effective instead of not effective? This is intentional.
Yes.
So I'm not thinking about my relationship as all the loving qualities that I want to bring. They're there. I'm thinking of how do I use myself as a really developed tool.
Yes.
And Deb, you've worked for years on this. How do I support myself? So how do I reflect with my colleagues? How do I use my supervisors? How do I use my opportunity for growth so I keep myself as a really developed tool of relating? Does that make sense?
It totally does. And I think in the absence of that, that's when we start to see that compassion fatigue and the burnout.
Absolutely.
And a lack of resiliency on the part of the practitioner. And so everything that you've been talking about during this conversation, I think about, and it's really, we can adjust for age and experience, but it's really no different. These come back to just basic human needs and human expression of our experience.
And yet, absolutely, Deb, but what we've laid out is really something that we know for children, we know for parents, and we know for providers. So our intentionality is what allows us to keep doing the work well. There's one last thought I'd love to share, which is someday. I found myself thinking as I anticipated this, how important that phrase someday is.
Yes.
And as COVID, I think we were all clobbered when the Delta variant came with ferociousness because we thought we had gotten to someday. But I think resilience and mastery really depend on the capacity for future orientation.
Yes.
Right? I mean, we know about the past, we have to stay in the present, but we have to be able to imagine the future. And for parents and providers, that means knowing that it will take time and practice to get to that someday.
Right. I always think of in education, I know a lot of educators like to use the word yet, which is the sister to someday.
Yes.
You're not, it's
you're not here yet.
Yes.
Someday you will.
Exactly.
Still hard, but someday we'll go to Target. And we didn't know we had a really crabby day, but someday soon we'll have a really nice day and say hooray.
Exactly.
The other idea that's very much in our science, in addition to positive affect, is growth and that growth mentality. And that's a someday model.
Yes.
That really is. That someday we'll get there. And I think as parents and families are struggling, that's what as providers we have to bring in, is that idea of someday.
Yes, and absolutely.
That's what resilience is.
Right. Well, I think this is a great place for us to end. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience with this. And I'll just end it with here's to someday coming really soon.
And someday seeing you again
in person.
In person.
Exactly, Anne. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.